This is The World Unpacked. Welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Doug Farrer. Today we're going to be talking about the Middle East. President Biden is traveling there for the first time, and tomorrow we'll be in Saudi Arabia, where he'll meet Mohammed bin Salman and talk about oil, Yemen, arms sales, and hopefully about human rights. We have Aaron David Miller on today, who's going to explain the stakes of President Biden's visit. Aaron's been a longtime expert in the Middle East, having worked at both the State Department, the Wilson Center, and now as a colleague of mine at the Carnegie Endowment. He's the host of Carnegie Connects, and he knows everything there is to know about this trip and about what's important about the U.S. relationship with the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and more. Here we go. Aaron, welcome to the show.
Doug, it's my first time, and I'm really happy to be here.
So let's just start with a baseline. Can we do a quick review of where we are in the U.S. Saudi bilateral relationship ahead of President Biden's trip?
Yeah. We're coming off of 16 months of what I would call, well, they called it the Khashoggi ban, which was an effort by the administration, largely driven by two things, I think. Number one, the ruthless and reckless behavior of Mohammed bin Salman, a.k.a. MBS, the putative king of Saudi Arabia once his father passes from the scene, who could rule Saudi Arabia for half a century. Extraordinary reformer bringing change to Saudi Arabia that nobody, not even the Saudi specialists or the Saudis themselves, would ever anticipate it. But a repressive, oppressive leader, I would think paranoid to some degree, has created a situation where there's zero political space in Saudi for dissent. In fact, dissent is criminalized. And during the course of the Trump administration, that ruthlessness and recklessness of MBS was largely ignored by Mr. Biden's predecessor.
Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, a friend of mine, a man who has really done things in the last 5 years in terms of opening up Saudi Arabia, and I think especially what you've done for women.
And culminated, in large part because I think the Trump administration gave them an extraordinary margin for error. Everything that happened in Saudi Arabia stays in Saudi Arabia. Culminated in the luring of Jamal Khashoggi, a Saudi patriot, a nationalist, who I think supported the regime and wanted reforms in order to allow his country, men and women, to express themselves, lured into the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, suffocated, killed, and then dismembered on the premises, his body disposed of. That single act, which brought home the ferocity and savagery victimized on a single individual, I think highlighted the ruthlessness of the regime. And in response, then campaign candidate Biden said things which I would argue were quite appropriate given how the Saudis were reacting. Things like it's a pariah nation, its leadership has little redeeming social value, and we're going to make the Saudis pay or make them pay for being a pariah state.
We were going to, in fact, make them pay the price and make them, in fact, the pariah that they are.
That set into motion a situation in which the Biden administration was seeing MBS, Jake Sullivan, Tony Blinken. We had no ambassador at the time, but there was no contact between the president and Mohammed bin Salman. And at a time when Mr. Biden was trying to re-inject values into American foreign policy, a frame emptied by his predecessor, the notion that Joe Biden could be defending human rights and democracy in helping Ukraine stand up to a brutal Russian invasion, and then having to engage with perhaps the most ruthless of Middle East authoritarians, perhaps Bashar Assad, I think, of Syria is in a class all by himself, created a huge conflict for the administration. And I think what brought the conflict to a fore was Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where 1 in 10 barrels of oil production in the world, which was what the Russians were producing, were basically taken offline, and you had a tremendous demand versus supply dysfunction.
So you talked about Biden's strong words for Mohammed bin Salman in a piece you wrote. And I guess I'm wondering, I'm thinking back to the Trump administration when President Trump met with Kim Jong-un, and it was sort of deemed as a potentially risky but also bold diplomatic move. It ultimately resulted in nothing, that really was permanent. Yet Biden is just getting pilloried for meeting with Mohammed bin Salman at all, and has kind of come out and said, well, it's not actually meeting with Mohammed bin Salman. It's sort of a broader bilateral. So is there anything the Biden administration can do to reframe this narrative as something a little more positive?
I think it's going to be very hard, Doug. First of all, meeting with authoritarians who are putative adversaries of the United States is one thing. Meeting with authoritarians who purport to be American partners or friends is another. Having to suffer through meetings with Kim Jong-un, Vladimir Putin, President Xi of China, belong in a different category than relating to the leader of a country with whom we've had a partnership with for decades is quite another. You would expect a higher standard. I think the problem that the president has is that there's very little that he is going to achieve on this trip that will serve as a sort of offset or counterpoint to the picture. There will be a photo at some point. Will they smile? Will they shake hands? Will somebody grab the other's forearm? And unless the administration can figure out a way to sort of create a measure of cover for itself, and there will be progress on the trip in several areas. There may be modest steps that the Israelis and Saudis are prepared to announce. Over time, the Saudis may have agreed to ramp up production, but nothing is going to ameliorate what you and I are paying for gas at the pumps.
So you mentioned what we're paying at the pump, and I think that there's a perception that this trip is really all about the price of oil.
To you, President Biden arrives here in the Middle East facing pressure at home to bring down skyrocketing gas prices.
Obviously, Saudi Arabia so far declined to increase the pumping of oil in order to offset the oil lost by the functional embargo against the Russians. Is President Biden going to succeed in getting Saudi Arabia to release more oil into the market and help lower the price of gas?
I think over time, the Saudis, they've already ramped up their production for July and August, over 50% of what they were producing. But it's not a light switch, as the famous Halima Croft suggested in an interview I did with her a couple weeks ago. It's not a light switch. The Saudis believe deeply in OPEC discipline. They're raking in billions of dollars from inflated oil prices. They don't want to alienate Vladimir Putin. And they are worried, as we all should be, of what happens when all of the sanctions that the Europeans have imposed on Putin with respect to oil and gas begin to kick in at the end of this year with the onset of winter. You could end up with a serious oil shortage. And I think the Saudis, interested in protecting their market share, will be very hesitant to provide enough oil that is going to matter to me and you and the rest of our fellow citizens at the pump.
President Biden did a Washington Post op-ed, which invariably, as presidents do, was a long list of successes of the Biden administration so far. Mentioned ending combat mission in Iraq, the general withdrawal of U.S. troops from the region, the truce in Yemen, and referred repeatedly to greater integration, which is sort of taking a little bit of credit for the Abraham Accords negotiated by Trump. So I'm wondering if you think this is an effort by President Biden to set the tone and who he was targeting as an audience for this op-ed.
I mean, look, I've written op-eds for secretaries of state before and contributed to speeches that the president gave. I didn't think this was a terribly effective op-ed. I don't think it was presidential. It was a sort of like the kitchen sink. It was a sort of an effort to review in 1,000 words everything that the administration had done, as you identified. and then to create a frame as to why it is in the interests of Mr. Biden to travel to the Middle East and to engage with the Saudis. I mean, it's not that it was inaccurate. I'm not sure it will be or is going to be very effective in changing anybody's minds, unless there's some event in the real world that normal human beings like you and I could point to that the president achieved on this trip. And I don't think he's setting expectations high. I think he's very realistic. I think he's looking forward to this Saudi stop, or at least any interaction with Mohammed bin Salman, the way you and I would look forward to a root canal operation. He's conflicted because part of the Joe Biden that believes in American values is now pinned on him from his previous statements. And 4 years after Jamal Khashoggi was murdered and dismembered, there is still no accounting or any accountability for what the intelligence community opined was Mohammed bin Salman's responsibility for the fate of Jamal Khashoggi. I don't think there's a way. We have U.S. Saudi dual nationals who are either in jail or restricted from travel, not to mention the other dissidents. So it would be nice to believe that there would be some significant move on human rights. I just don't see it. And as a consequence, I think the trip will come and go, assuming there are no gaffes or blunders or howlers, without much political benefit to the president.
I agree that there's probably no political upside unless he can quickly and dramatically reduce inflation and the price of gas for American consumers, frankly. But there might be political downside, don't you think? I mean, the Republicans in Congress are unhappy. It seems like a lot of the Democrats in Congress are unhappy. The Washington Post is probably skeptical. I mean, it seems like he's taking a big risk here.
Don't forget the human rights community. We referred earlier to the three constituencies that will not be happy or satisfied. One is the Washington Post and the media. The second is Congress. You've already seen at least one letter from influential senators. And the human rights community, which has weighed in any number of, public writings and utterances about the ruthlessness of MBS.
I'm sure that President Biden isn't thinking about his successors with this trip, but Mohammed bin Salman's only 36 years old. He's sort of like one of our new Supreme Court justices here in the U.S. with a lifetime appointment and basically no consequences for his actions. So what's the long-term trajectory for U.S. Saudi relations? And where would you set the path or tell President Biden and potential successors to set this path for this bilateral relationship?
I think one of the unfortunate things about the visit is that you mentioned one Middle East politician, Mohammed bin Salman, who is probably looking past Joe Biden. The other one is Benjamin Netanyahu, a putative prime minister who hopes to win and become prime minister again in Israel's elections, both on November 1st. Both of these guys are looking past Joe Biden. Both of them would prefer to be dealing with the Republicans. Both of them, I think, are hoping for Republican victories in the midterms. And both of them, I think, would like to see the return of Donald Trump or his avatar. So whoever is president of the United States in 2024, whatever the shape of the Congress is, we've got to, I think, reset is a terrible word. We need reciprocity in the U.S. Saudi relationship. We need mutual respect for one another's interests. In my view, and I'm not sure I'm in the majority on this, Saudi Arabia is not an ally of the United States. There's an episodic coincidence of interest between the U.S. and the Saudis, and no coincidence of values, and no solid base of domestic support. So we need to be, I think, clear-eyed about what to expect from the Saudis. And they clearly will make their own assessment of what they need from us. So I think that it may well be we're going to be dependent on Arab hydrocarbons for a long, or at least the world will. And the Saudis operate in a different neighborhood, difficult neighborhood. They're going to need stuff from us on the security side. The question is whether or not we could find a way to calibrate the oil for security trade-off in a way that generates mutual confidence and trust and doesn't breed this kind of suspicion. And part of the problem is the mercurial personality of the Crown Prince. Extraordinary reformer, as I mentioned. But the price is high, and the identification of the United States with his actions undermines our own credibility. So, bottom line, I think it's going to be a very tough line to navigate, and this is going to remain a troubled relationship for a long time to come.
Besides oil, there is another thing that the United States is considering in its relationship with Saudi Arabia, which was reported to be the lifting of the sale of offensive weapons to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has been a long-time consumer of U.S. arms and has built quite a constituency within the United States that supports these arms purchases. But the U.S. blocked the sale of these weapons to punish Saudi Arabia for what's going on in Yemen and what the U.S. declares are indiscriminate attacks against the Houthi rebels that have killed scores of civilians. So do you think the United States will proceed with the lifting of the sale of offensive weapons? And if they do, what should they get in exchange for these weapons?
You know, on one hand, weapon sales create an interlocking set of relationships which create dependence. And the administration is clearly concerned about Saudi hedging. They clearly have no intention of breaking with the Russians or the Chinese. If the Saudis are in the process of buying sophisticated drones or missiles from the Chinese, that's going to be a problem. As we've seen with the F-35 sale with the Emirates, which is now, I think, suspended as a consequence of our concerns over China's ability to penetrate the Emirates with the sale of certain technologies that would make the F-35 vulnerable. And the difference between an offensive and a defensive weapon is going to be arguable here. We imposed this ban, if that's what it was, as a consequence of Saudi Arabia's, again, reckless and disastrous war in Yemen, which is MBS's war. I'd be surprised, frankly, if the administration comes back and presents Congress with a big-ticket, high-profile set of offensive weapons.
A popular tactic being taken by lots of countries who aren't close allies of the United States around the world but want relationships with the U.S. is to counterbalance us with either Russia or China. And in the case of Saudi Arabia, it's sort of curious to me that they haven't tried to move closer to the Chinese, especially with President Biden being so critical. The Chinese need hydrocarbons. They have a large market. They're closer physically to Saudi Arabia. So what keeps Saudi Arabia interested in having a special relationship with the United States?
First of all, I think MBS has visited Beijing, and one of the administration's concerns is the sale of sophisticated weaponry from China to Saudi Arabia, particularly drones and missiles. I think the Saudis looking at Ukraine and the extraordinarily poor performance of the Russian military basically are making a calculation. Who or what is going to bail us out if we get into trouble? Will it be China or Russia? It'll be neither of those. We have basing rights in Bahrain, in Qatar, Al Dhafra in the Emirates. We've been Saudi Arabia's main source of weapon supply. Saudis train in the United States with the U.S. military. At the same time, I think the Saudis are hedging. They're not going to break their OPEC Plus agreement with the Russians. and they're not. You mentioned the oil factor. Only recently has Russia replaced Saudi Arabia as the largest exporter of hydrocarbons to China. And, in a way, the U.S. Navy is protecting Chinese supply lines in the Gulf. So the Chinese are getting a free ride on the back of the U.S. military and Navy in terms of making sure the oil continues to flow. But the hedging is going to continue, as if to say the United States, if you're withdrawing, if you're retrenching, if you have been our patron these many years and you're now recalculating, well, smaller powers have to make their own adjustments.
Is the United States just deprioritizing the Middle East?
We're not withdrawing from the Middle East. We've clearly deprioritized it. But I think one of the advantages of that is that the smaller powers then look to one another. And there's no doubt that Israel's relations with the Gulf, Saudis and the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, was driven partly sure by fear of a rising Iran and the rise of Sunni jihadi terror, ISIS, Al-Qaeda. But it was also driven by their concern that the U.S. Was not as interested in their region as it used to be, which is a fact. I think it's true. And they've gotten together. The Trump administration, they deserve credit. The bus, I think, was about to leave the station, but the Trump administration got on that bus and drove it in a single-minded, transactional way, probably that no Democratic administration would, with respect to giving the Arabs what they wanted in order to move closer to the Israelis. The Moroccans got sovereignty over the Western Sahara. And no Democratic administration would have made that, or no responsible Republican administration would have made that move. The Emiratis got F-35s. The Bahrainis got assurances on our support against Iran. And the Sudanese got off the terrorism list. So one of the virtues of deprioritizing has been we've driven them together. And I think that's real.
When we come back, I'll ask Aaron all about U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East generally and whether the United States can still lead with a values-based foreign policy. Hey, thanks for listening to The World Unpacked. We have a lot of fun putting this show together, but we can't do it without your generous support. To support the work that we do on this podcast and the work of the Carnegie Endowment, please visit ceip.org/donate. Thanks. Aaron, you've spent basically your entire career analyzing the Middle East, including a couple decades at the State Department, working on Israeli-Palestinian peace issues, notably, among other things. You've worked for Republicans, you've worked for Democrats. What has changed or shifted in the way the United States engages with the Middle East today compared to when you first started out as a young diplomat?
I think there are profound changes driven by a number of factors. First and foremost is our very unhappy experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's hard to justify the sacrifices we've made in terms of what we see now as returns for 2 decades. The standard for victory of these wars probably was never could we win, but when could we leave? And the leaving has, particularly with respect to Afghanistan, the 1-year anniversary of the leaving is next month. That's fact number one. Number two is a rising China. The so-called pivot to Asia has actually been made real now in a way that, again, normal humans could understand, that we are now focused to a much greater extent than back in the day in the 80s and the 90s on the challenge of China. NATO is even looking at China not as an adversary. I think the word they used in their concept document was challenge, Chinese challenge. Then you have domestic travails, which has caused a sort of inward-looking approach on any number of foreign policy issues over the course of the last decade, certainly over the course of the last 4 years. But I think if you ask me what's changed the most, I think it's a realization that this is not a region of opportunity for the United States. It's a region where presidential ideas more often than not go to die. It's a region where the problems in the Middle East, lack of accountability, respect for human rights, lack of gender equality, bad governance, no governance, sectarian tensions, the presence of extractive leaders who seem to care more about their own personal affiliations and fortunes, much less about their publics, the well-being of their publics, has created a sense that, with some exception, most of the problems in this region are way beyond the capacity of America, even with its allies, to repair. And it is, I think, to some, the epitome of arrogance that as our own broken house continues to be set with so many problems, which have reflected now on our political stability in the eyes of others around the world, to presume that we now have answers that are going to fix the problems of what is clearly, without exception, the most dysfunctional, broken, and angry part of the world. Fewer democracies, more terror, more violence. I think that, in the sense, has been, my judgment, been the biggest change.
How would you define America's core interests in the Middle East?
I would say to you, preventing a catastrophic terror attack on the continent of the United States. 1, that originated in this region. 2, maintaining access to Arab hydrocarbons at reasonable prices, not because we need the oil, because the rest of the financial and economic system needs it. And 3, preventing the emergence of a regional hegemon with a nuclear weapon and or a race to the bottom of competing powers in this region who want nuclear weapons. Those are 3 issues cut to the core of American security and prosperity. All the others, democratization, what to do about the terrible, until Ukraine, Syria produced the largest single refugee flow since the end of the Second World War, humanitarian disaster, Yemen, solving the Israeli-Palestinian problem, what to do about Iran's putative search for enough fissile material to make a weapon, and then maybe even to think about weaponizing. All that stuff is going to be hard to resolve. We need to figure out a way to manage as best we can, and it's not a happy or a pretty picture.
So President Biden built his political platform around the idea in foreign policy that America would lead the world through its principles and its values again, right? The shining city on the hill. And a large part he did that because President Trump sort of made a mockery of those ideals. Did President Trump show us that the United States is just, quote, a normal country which is pursuing its own interests abroad? Or are we, or have we ever been one where values and principles like human rights and democracy are central to our foreign policy? I mean, you've seen a lot of presidents. Has this ever been true? And has anyone done it well?
There's tension, and there always has been in American foreign policy going back to the 18th century, between ideals and self-interest. In the administrations I worked for, I don't think I could identify one that consistently put human rights and democracy promotion at the top of their agenda. And when that course was tried, it demonstrated more weakness, frankly, than American influence and power. we have to promote values. But if we're going to do it, and we should do it, we have to be consistent. We have to understand that those values coexist with other interests that are going to compete for our attention. And it would be best if we worked on these issues with others. I just think it's a hopeless mix of two kinds of propositions that leads to anomaly, inconsistency, and hypocrisy. John McCain were here talking to us. He'd say, and I had the honor of talking to him about this twice. He believed deeply that our interests are our values and our values are our interests. We just don't behave that way. When Joe Biden was originally confronted with the idea of going to Saudi Arabia, according to Politico, he angrily responded, "The presidency has to stand for something." I think he's right. So this is an uneasy balance that is never going to be resolved, in my judgment, in a way that is going to satisfy either the realists or those who want to promote human rights in a serious way.
Aaron, you concluded an opinion piece you recently wrote for CNN that Joe Biden might want to forget about the Middle East, but the Middle East won't forget about us. And I appreciate you coming on to tell us all about the trip, about the context of the U.S. Saudi relationship, about Israel and human rights, and how to put that at the center of your foreign policy. For everyone listening, Aaron hosts a podcast and a live event almost every week called Carnegie Connects. We'll put a link to sign up to hear about those in the show notes. He just got off with James Clapper, but he's also had folks like Madeleine Albright and many others on the show. It's incredible, and you should all go check it out. Aaron, thanks again.
Doug, it's always a pleasure. Look forward to coming on again.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of The World Unpacked, a podcast produced by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts, and if you like the show, please rate and subscribe. The World Unpacked is produced by Cliff Jayapranada and Clarissa Guerrero, and edited by our audio engineer, Tim Martin. See you next time.